people. And now we know the official number by Johns Hopkins is 1 in 120. But the latest research, the absolute latest that I've heard is that a group of celiac researchers say that they believe that everyone is gluten sensitive, but only a third of the population is showing symptoms at any given moment. And when you go back and you study the origin of wheat, which I've done, and what our northern Germanic ancestors did to wheat back in the mid-4th century, and that it completely changed gluten forever, that it would make perfectly good sense that everyone who eats it, including four-legged creatures, would be sickened by today's man-made gluten. And that only a third of us are showing symptoms at any given moment, but that doesn't mean that it's not doing something harmful to everybody who consumes it. And so you've seen miracles happen. I've seen just major miracles happen when we get people and animals off of this stuff. And so I wrote 10 years ago that I thought that it wasn't good for anybody. It was just better tolerated by some. Because that just made sense to me, and now it looks like we're actually getting some backing of our celiac brothers who are saying that. So I think the term celiac disease is about to go the way of the buffalo, and we're going to opt for gluten sensitivity, and that just makes sense to me.
Yeah, I would love to see that day happen, and I agree with you. I think we're right around the corner. I want to ask you a little bit about, you talked about pulling dogs off of grain. Kind of, where did you embark upon starting with animals? Was it after you were diagnosed or your brother was diagnosed and kind of changed your own life?
Yes, oh, definitely. It just made sense to me. And of course, when my brother handed me that email, I said, I've heard of celiac disease. And he said, you have? Where you heard of it? And it took me a second. I had to dig it, out of one of the corners of my brain. And fortunately, I've been very trivia-oriented all my life, and it's paying off now in medicine because I really soak up medical trivia now. And I said, we learned about it in the dog. It was the Irish setter. We were taught about gluten intolerance in the Irish setter 30 years ago, and I had a little pregnant pause, and I went, that's where all the Irish setters have gone. I have one Irish setter in my computer. And when I do veterinary lectures and I get to that point, I say, how many of you have Irish setters in your computer logs? And, most people don't raise their hand. And you go, you know where they went? And they all look at you like, why, do you know? And you go, yeah, that's what happens when you feed a celiac wheat. They just don't do very well. 30 years ago, dog food was made of corn. The dry food was made of corn. The only wheat they were getting was either in table food, which is one of the reasons why we tabooed table food, which is crazy when we taboo healthy table food too. We throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the only dog food that they had that had wheat in it was we had some treats that I won't name the proper name of. But we had some treats that had both milk and wheat in them. We had table food, but dog food was made of corn. It was not until 10 years after I graduated from veterinary school, and I remember it now in retrospect like yesterday, that we transitioned from corn to wheat-based dog foods. And we all missed it. It all went all over our heads. The dogs were vomiting, having diarrhea when we transitioned to wheat-based dog foods, and we thought that there was something wrong with the dogs. Which is crazy as it sounds, but we were so sold out that the commercial pet food industry knew exactly what they were doing that we let this all go over our heads, and so our solution to this was, well, what you need to do is go back and buy a bag of your old dog food and gradually work in the new food, because dogs don't do well with diet changes. And I'll put a parenthesis for a second. You say, but they're scavengers and they eat something different almost every day. So that explanation just does not fly in retrospect. But that was our explanation at the time. And so we gradually worked in these wheat-based dog foods for 4 or 5 days, and the dogs adapted. I write a lot about adaptation on my website. It's a fascinating process. And it only takes you about 3 to 4 days to adapt to something that's bad for you, whether it's cigarettes, alcohol, illicit drugs, or wheat-based dog foods. It's amazing how quickly we adapt, but that does not mean that we're going to do well with it. It just means that our symptoms are going to go away until the next set come up. And so in retrospect, all of this came flooding back to me in a matter of days. And my brother and I used to go into my office, which we started calling the inner sanctum, and brainstorming. And my brother's very, very smart guy. Should have been a doctor. He's an electrical engineer, but he has a very analytical brain. And we were just hashing through all this stuff. And I said, we got to get all these dogs off of wheat. And so all of a sudden, dogs started getting better. But the hook was the epilepsy thing. In my celiac research, I found that celiac children that had epilepsy that went on gluten-free diets oftentimes had dramatic improvements. And for some reason, and you and I know what that reason was, we were talking about it before the show, this really hooked my attention. And I said, well, what in the world could be in gluten that is causing seizures in dogs and people when we like to use this word idiopathic? And the new definition of the word idiopathic is that the doctor's an idiot and it's pathetic for the patient. And I say that very tongue-in-cheek because, none of these doctors are idiots. Nobody should ever call them such. They're very learned people. They just haven't been taught some very important stuff, and you and I have had to dig this out after our training. I certainly have, and I wouldn't call any of my colleagues idiots, but a lot of the patients would. I mean, the patients and the dogs aren't calling us idiots, but the human patients are using that word a lot, unfortunately, and giving us a bad name. So it's time we learned all of this stuff and started using it. But I did a little research into epilepsy, and I found that MSG was a major trigger of seizures, monosodium glutamate. And so my first thought, as hard as it is to believe, as simple as it was, is I said, I wonder if there's glutamate in gluten. And so I looked up the chemical structure of gluten, and son of a gun, it's like 40% glutamic acid by weight. It's super, super rich in glutamic acid. And I went, could it be that it's the glutamic acid in the gluten that's triggering the seizures? And so I started I had about 5 epileptic dogs that were on low doses of phenobarbital, or some of them didn't even need it. They had so few seizures. And I put them on wheat-free diets, and every single one of them stopped seizing.